And the next thing that I want to do is actually practice post. So at this point, we actually pretty much did a lot of GET calls, but with HTTP beans, you can actually make all kinds of other API calls. And another example will be making a post. So in order to make a post call, the same idea, I'm going back to httpbeans.org. I just need to find the right endpoint, and /post is the endpoint that I need. And in order to do this, I'm just going to copy the endpoint again. I will open a new tab, paste its URL, replace the endpoint with post, and I need to update the method. The method is post. Again, this information I'm just taking from here. So the method you see over here on the left side in the squares, and that /post is just endpoint itself. So this is it. So let's send it. And when we make this API call, we get back status code 200. And over here, we also get back some information about the requested link. Now, when we make post calls, very often, we do them in order to send some information to the server. So get is usually used in order to receive some information, in order to view some data. And post is usually used when we try to send something to the server, so this information can be stored or this information can be processed. So when you make post calls, very often, you use body in order to pass the information to the server. So if I go to body over here, I can actually send some data to the server through that. So if I just pick row, and let's say JSON here, for example, I can create a body of this call. And let's say we want to pass name and send the name to Luana. Now, this API is a test API, so it takes whatever you send to it. In the real life, when you are testing, you will be taking the key values from the development documentation. So in your development documentation, you will see the values, like basically, the keys that you are able to use with an API. And then you will be just populating those keys with the values that you want to send. So let's send it. And you can see that the server actually understood it, and it understands that I sent the name, and this is the value. Now, you can pass multiple different key values. So for example, email. We can pass empty strings over here as well. We can add all kinds of digits as well. And we can also pass all kinds of lists or arrays using APIs. So for example, let's say we have list of URLs stored for this user, and just over here. So this is JSON. I'm just creating some totally random strings so you understand how it is formed. And again, in here, in this API, I can pretty much pass whatever I want. So I just create a valid payload, and over here, just add some different parameters. And when I click send, you can see that all of them are sent to the server side, and under data, it actually returns me everything that I sent. So you can see all this information. So this is how we generate post. Just again, select post, provide the URL. If headers are needed, you can update headers over here. And then if you go to body, you select row, and then you select the format in which you want to send the data, for example, JSON, but it can also be simple text, by the way. And then you just click this send button, and it actually sends the information. So that's how you make an API call for post. All right, and let's go back here. And now, the next thing that I want to show you really quickly is that with Postman, you can actually create the dependencies. So with Postman, you can create sequence of API calls. And for example, you can make one API call, get some information that you get from it. And then when you make another API call, it will use that information from the first one. So you can basically create a sequence of calls. Now, in order to do this, I basically have instruction on how to do it on this website, but let's try to do it ourselves. And in order to do this, let's use this unique identifier endpoint, because it always returns us a unique ID. And then let's make a post call using that unique ID. So let's go to Postman, and over here, I have this first call that I made. It's get this endpoint, and it returns this unique ID. Now, let's say I want to store this parameter, right? I want to store the value of this ID so I can use it in my future tests. Because, for example, I have a test case that logs user in, gets this ID value and probably authorization value, saves that, and then makes another API call, like purchase something, and it's using that ID value and authorization token. And I don't want to manually copy and paste those parameters from one API call to another. So in order to save that information in Postman, we need to work with this tab. It's called tests. So tests is the tab that allows you to add automated tests to Postman. So you can actually have some automation. And now we will be talking about that later in more details. But for now, we're just going to use this tab in order to set the variable so we can then use it in the next one. So in our case, we will be working with two different APIs. So we will set this unique ID as a global variable. So in order to do that, we go to this tab, and in Postman, we actually have snippets. You can always see them over here on the right side. And snippets are very helpful because they basically contain some code that is already pre-populated for you. So in your case, you just click on this one, get a, set a global variable. And Postman will just populate the line for you, right? So I clicked it 2 times, but this is what you usually get. Now, at first you need to provide the variable key, how you want to call this variable in your Postman. So in our case, let's just call it the ID. So I'm just gonna provide it over here. And then over here, you want to set the value of it. But in order to set the value, we actually need to grab this value from the response itself. So in order to do that in Postman, you can always just work with the response contents using pm.response. And over here, we can just type that in. So pm.response.json. That will basically get the whole value of our response. And after that, we just need to provide the name of the key that we want to use. So this is basically our ID that we are getting, and that will allow us to set that as a variable. And you can also just copy the lane from here. In our case, we can just type this one. So if I make this API call, it will send this request. You will see a different ID. Again, it always returns a different ID, but this variable will be set on the global level. And now if we're trying to make this post, and let's say in our post, we want to pass that ID as a value, over here, we can just create another JSON object. Let's call it ID, and we can just provide the ID over here. So in Postman, if you're just setting something to string, right, like hard coding it to string, you just put it in double quotes and provide the value. Now, if you want this to not be hard coded, but instead to be pulled dynamically from the Postman variables, we always just use the curly brackets. So in our case, basically, you just pass it as the actual name of the variable in the brackets inside the payload. So over here, just gonna paste those. You can see that Postman already highlights them because that's how we are getting the variables. And here we just provide the name of the variable. That's the name that we've sent. So we just put it here. And now if we send it, you will see that this UI ID is actually the one that we received in this API call, right? So this is how you can pass variables from one API call to another one. At this point, it probably doesn't make much sense, but it will be very useful for us when we will be doing testing of sequence of different calls and performing a lot of API calls one after another. So you don't have to manually take this value from this response, go to the next call, and just copy and paste it. Postman is very powerful. You can set a lot of variables like that, and they just will be stored for you. All right, so those are pretty much the main Postman features, and I hope it's clear how to make API calls. Again, I just showed you some pretty different pieces of functionality, but most of the time when we will be working with APIs and when we will be working with API calls, we basically will just open the documentation for an API, we'll copy the method, we'll copy the endpoint, and then if there are certain parameters, they will be described here, so we will copy them to our request, and we will just verify that the response that we have in documentation matches what we actually get in the response. So that's the idea, and at this point, we are pretty much ready to make a lot of API calls. Now, before we wrap it up, let me show you one more thing. So when you make an API call, server obviously sees it, and the server tries to parse the information that you're sending and fulfill this API call. So when you make a request, server analyzes everything that it sees, and it gets all that information, and then based on whatever server receives, it will generate the response and will send it back to you. Now, there is this playground number 2 that I have. It's called request bin. This is a very cool website for those of you who are interested in seeing what exactly server is getting when you make an API call. So if you just go to requestbin.com, over here, it has this tiny link to create a public bin. So that's the link that I will be using. Again, I'm not using this button, I'm just using create a public link, create a public bin link. So if I click on it, it will provide me this endpoint that I can copy. And now everything that will come to this URL, to this endpoint, will be displayed here. So basically using this website, I can see everything that server is getting when I'm sending an API call to this endpoint, and I can send all kinds of different calls. So let's just copy this, go back to Postman, and let's just play with it a little bit. So I'm just gonna create a new call, get, and in here, I'm just gonna paste the URL, and then I'm just gonna click send. So when I do this, it's gonna send the request, success is true, status 200. So if I go back to the website, you will see that this request was just made, it's right here. And if I open it, I will be able to see all the information that the server received. So here you can see everything that Postman sent, my user agent, Postman token, and so on. Now I can modify this call, and let's take a look at what our server says. So let's just play with it a little bit. And for example, instead of get, let's put post, and let's provide some body. So for example, let's just go with some JSON, just put some parameters. So for example, password, secured, and then let's say we want to see name, the way, Command B will actually format the payload for you. So if you just hit Command B on your keyboard, if you're in Mac, it will automatically make it beautiful and show you payload in the proper form. So let's make a call with these parameters. I'm going to hit send. And then let's go back to our website. And now you can see that post call was received, and if we go to row, we will see the data that the server got, and we also see some headers that the server understood from our request that we've made. Now, with Postman, you can send data in all kinds of possible formats, and in fact, it's totally up to your backend developer how you're going to be sending the data. I'm using JSON in my examples because it's what people use very often these days, and it's pretty much what I see everywhere I go. But keep in mind that data can be sent in all kinds of different formats, and for example, if I replace JSON here with XML, I can send data in an XML format. So I have an example over here of an XML. So I can just copy this, paste it to Postman. Now you can see that the format of the data is a little bit different. So this is XML. And when I hit send and go back to my request bin, you will be able to see that it also got this data in XML format. So XML, just like a JSON, is just another format on how you can actually send your data, and you can see that the structure is a little bit different. During this course, we will be mostly working with JSON, but just keep in mind that this also exists. It doesn't really make a huge difference when you test APIs, how exactly which format you're sending the data, but just more for your information. Now, we can also send our data as, let's say, simple text, or we can also send the form data. So for example, I select form data here and provide some example. This is something that we this is something that allows us to send our data this way. So if I hit send and go back here, you will see that server actually received that basically as a form. Form data used to be a pretty common way of authorizing the users. And it's not very common these days. Most people now do that through JSON. But again, you can, if you need to, always use it in Postman. And then besides that, in our body, we can also send a binary. So if you have a file that you, for example, uploading to a website, we also can do it through Post. And that's exactly what the website is doing. And in Postman, you can simulate that. You can just create basically an API call and add some sort of file. So I just basically clicked on this binary, click on the select file, selected the file, and now I can send it. And this will actually send that whole file that I've just attached to the backend, to the server. So in our case, if we go back to this, under post, you will be able to see the actual file, how it receives it. So it's just the binary itself. And that's basically how server sees the files. And again, all the headers, everything is here. So this is just how server gets our API calls. Again, everything that you put in your API call will be sent, and server will see everything. If you modify the headers, that information will also be reflected, and the server side will also see. For example, let's just add some totally random header. Let's call it lesson. And in here, let's just provide some value. And if I hit send, let's go back to our bin. Let's go to headers. You will see that this parameter, this header is here, and this is the value, right? So everything that is sent through Postman will go to the server, and the server will analyze it. So during this course, basically what we will be doing this whole time, we will be making a bunch of API calls to certain endpoints that we find in our documentation, and then we will be validating that when we make those API calls, we get back the correct status code, the time of the response is acceptable, and then if there is a certain body or headers that we should get back in the response, those are correct. So that's basically it for today. Let's go back here. And at this point, we've learned pretty much how to make all kinds of API calls through Postman, and we just looked at different Postman features. So hopefully that was helpful. In the next lesson, we will try to apply this knowledge and actually try to test our first API, make a few calls, and validate that the information that we get back is what we expect it to be. So that's it for today. Thank you for watching this video. Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Lana Levinson, and today we are continuing our API testing course. So today's going to be our lesson number 3, the testing process. And then we'll test a real API. So the fun part starts today, and let's just jump right into it. So before we start doing the testing, let's just talk about the process in general, right? How do we test an API? First of all, in order to do the API testing, we need to have the documentation. Otherwise, it's simply impossible for us to do our testing, because if you think about making an API call, we need to know the method that we have to use. We need to know the URL, where we're going to send this API call. If this API has certain parameters, headers, or body that is supposed to be sent, we also need to know this information before we start doing our testing. Without knowing this, it's simply impossible, for example, just to guess what is the URL where we're going to send this. So the first stage is to receive and get the testing documentation, the API documentation from the developers. Now, there are all kinds of forms for this documentation. Some people keep their API documentation in Swagger. And for example, this is how it looks. So if I go to swagger.io, this website has a set of test APIs. We will talk about them later during this course, but this is basically how Swagger documentation looks. It always has the base URL information, and then it has a bunch of endpoints with explanation on how to make an API call and which responses we expect to get in case this API call is successful or not successful. Now, besides that, companies may keep API documentation in Confluence. They can keep API documentation in the GitHub, so it's really up to the company. When you join a company, they will provide you the link, so you will have access. Now, after we get the documentation from developers about our API, we usually just start reading it and analyzing it just to make sure that it's full enough and it covers a lot of cases. For example, if you need to test a login API and you receive the documentation that explains how to make an API call and what information this API should return in case user is logged in successfully, this is not enough, because as you may imagine, a very common case for users will be to enter incorrect password. And in case this is happening, we also have to have the information on what we expect to get back from the API. Should we get back 401? Should we get back 400? Should we get back some sort of error message? All of that should be reflected in our API documentation. So we read through it. If we see that some cases are missing, we can just clarify them with developers. Now, after we go over API documentation, that is basically enough. At this point, we can start creating test cases, or in some companies, they just create checklists on what exactly we are planning to verify during our API testing. So test cases will be more detailed with particular steps, with expected results and so on. Checklists will be shorter, which basically will be like verify this case, verify this functionality, and just make sure that things are working. Now, after we document some test cases, we execute them, and we just perform a lot of API calls in Postman and verify that the information that we get back when we call a certain API matches to what we expect to get back. If there are any issues, we file them. And then in some cases, it's possible that some managers may ask you to provide just some summary report on how many test cases you performed, how many of them failed versus how many of them passed. So you can create one of those. And also, if you discovered any bugs, there are definitely going to be bug fixes. So you will be also doing bug fix verification at the end of your testing. So that's basically it. That's the process. And this is something that we will do today. Just keep in mind that you need to have the documentation. Otherwise, it's impossible to do the testing. All right, so let's start our testing. Today we will work with Weather API, and we will use the website OpenWeather, which is one of the very famous APIs for Weather. And basically what this website allows us to do, let's just open it. It allows us to take their APIs and implement them on our own websites or on our own mobile apps. So for example, if your company is building a website that also allows users to see the weather information, or a mobile app that also includes weather information, OpenWeather would be a very good resource to use. So OpenWeather APIs will always be just returning the weather information, and your company doesn't have to build their own API service like this. They can just take the existing APIs from OpenWeather. So those APIs are totally real. They're not for testing only purposes. And these APIs provided by OpenWeather are used by probably by hundreds and probably even thousands of websites and mobile apps. So this is a very popular real-life server, and I think it's a very good candidate for our testing. All right, in order to do the testing on OpenWeather API, you will need to have an API key. API key from OpenWeather allows you to perform API calls that basically will be talking with OpenWeather services. Now, in order to get this key, let me just open this page in incognito mode. You basically just need to go to openweathermap.org and create an account. That's it. You don't have to purchase anything. If you just register an account, it will create a free subscription for you, and your free account is more than enough to do the testing that we will be doing today. So when I just go to the sign in page over here, it has this link to create an account. Just keep in mind that if you are looking at this recordings later in the future and the interface changed a little, maybe you will need to look for that button anywhere else on the site. But right now, if I just go to sign in, create an account, it will open this form. And in here, you just need to provide your username, email, and password. And you can just register on this website. After you register, they usually send you an email confirmation, and you will need to open your email and confirm your registration. And after that, you're ready. You can just use this website. So I already created an account today, and after you create an account, when you go to openweathermap.org and log in, this is basically how it looks for you. And over here on the right side, you can see that I have this drop down where I can select my API keys. And when I click on it, it takes me to this page with this key, right? So this is the secured API key generated just for my user. You will have your own. And this is the key that you will need to use in order to make API calls. Now, this website has a lot of APIs, and if you go to just API over here, you will see a lot of information and a lot of different things that you can actually get through this website by making the API calls. And by the way, I encourage you to try and play with another API after we finish today's class, so you can practice more. This website has tons of them. But today we're going to start with the most basic one, with this current weather data. And in here, you can see they have a button for API documentation. So I'm going to click here, and it will open this page for me. And in here, you can see that it has a lot of different APIs that I can use in order to get weather for one location or for several cities and so on. Now, today I want to work with this one. I want to get the current weather data for one location, and I want to use this API by city ID. So this API allows us to get weather information for a particular city. And in order to receive this information, we need to provide the city ID. And by the way, this website has the link to the list of city IDs over here. You can download it. Also, in order to make this API call, you have to provide app ID, which is your unique API key. So that's the key that I just showed you. And then this API also allows you to provide a lot of optional parameters that we will use today and we will also test today. So that is basically it. This is our API documentation. It's not very detailed, but it totally allows us to at least get an idea on how to make this API call and what possible parameters are, and that's exactly where we're going to start. So let's start, before we get into our own testing documentation, let's just start with trying to make this API call just to make sure that everything is right, this API works overall, and we can work with this in Postman. So I'm just going to copy this whole endpoint over here, go back to my Postman, and in my Postman, I no longer need the HTTP bin. I can just paste this URL for OpenWeather. And in order to make a call, let's add HTTPS beginning, right? When we call APIs or open web pages, it always starts with HTTPS or HTTP. In this case, this website is using HTTPS, it's secured, so we just provide this information here. And then we have two parameters. We have city ID and we have the API key that we need to put over here. So let's start with the city ID. How can we get it? If you go back to this website, by city ID, link over here has the information about which IDs you have to provide, and it also has the link of cities that you can actually use for this website. So if you go to this current city list.json, it will download this file, basically archive, with the information on cities. So after it's downloaded, I can open it. And now over here, you can see that it opens this information, and here I just have one JSON file. Now I need to have a way to read it. Usually you can just paste it to your text editor, and in many cases it will read it. I myself like to use this app that is called Sublime. By the way, you can download it for free from internet, just look for Sublime if you are interested. Or another good one is called Atom. I don't have it installed, but Atom also is a good code editor, and it will also be able to read JSON files. I'm gonna go with Sublime though. And in here, after it is open, I can just put my file into this editor. So I'm just gonna drag and drop this JSON file. And after it loads, there we go. Now we can see the list of cities, right? And in here, we can find all kinds of cities. And the most important information for us here is this ID. So this ID is the ID that allows us to basically look for a certain city. So let's look across this file. I'm just gonna hit Command F to look in here, and let's search for London. For example, this is a very popular location, and you can see that it actually has a lot of information. So sometimes you just need to like read through this APIs just to understand what particularly you need to basically which city particularly you're looking for. This one looks pretty relevant. So let's take just this ID as an example, and now we can go back to our Postman and just populate the city. Obviously, it doesn't matter which city you pick. I just selected London because it's easy. But you can just pick any city from this list, right? You can even just randomly take the top one, which is this one. It just needs to be a valid ID. That's the only thing, right? And then after we have city ID, we also need to provide our API key. So in here, we need to just populate this API key with the parameter that we have for this website. So I go back to this website. I go back to my API keys. And in here, I'm just going to copy this key and paste it to my Postman. So that's basically it, right? That should allow us to do an API call. I hope I copied the city ID correctly. Let's just make a call and see what information we get back. So when I make this API call, you can see that it actually works and it returns some information for us. Country is Great Britain. Okay, sounds about right. And here we have some coordinates. We have the actual weather information. So this API totally works as expected. Now, one thing that I can also show you here is that all these parameters that we've entered here, if we go to this tab of params, they will be reflected, right? Just like we looked at this the last time. Now, if you turn off this app ID parameter, that's your unique key, and just make this API call, you can see that it won't let you. It will tell you that this is an invalid key, and it will basically send you to the error states for this website, so you can find out exactly what went wrong. By the way, we can just open this page too with list of errors, and this page just includes some information on generic errors that this website, this APIs may return. So for example, here we have some information that if we get back 401, it means that we either didn't specify the key or the key wasn't activated. By the way, make sure to verify your email, right? And so on. 404. If you provide the wrong ID or wrong name, 429, if you are on the free subscription but you make too many calls. And also this website has this nice comment that if API calls return 500 kind of status codes, they ask people to contact them, because if you ever see 500 status codes being returned by your server, this is clearly a backend bug on the server side. All right, so let's go back here to our API documentation. API, current weather by city ID. And in here, as I mentioned, we can find all the information about the call that we can make and all the possible parameters, right? So you can see that besides providing the city ID, we can also provide the parameter modes. We can also set units. We can also set language. And in order to test this API, we basically need to make sure that all these parameters are working exactly as it's described in this documentation. And we need to make sure that when we combine different parameters, the API still keeps on working and we don't get any errors. Now, in order to do testing more efficient way, I created this document that will be available under the materials for this lesson. And this document includes API test cases. It will include API test cases. We are going to create them right now. And also it includes the summary of this API documentation. So this is the link to the documentation for this particular API. Here's also the link to the archived file that I just downloaded with city IDs. And here I put some information about the parameters that I basically just copied and pasted those parameters from this website. The only parameter I am excluding is this mode, right? I'm not taking it right now into our testing. Mode is just the parameter that allows you to get data in different formats. By default, it's returning JSON. We will be working with JSON today. It's not very common if basically the cases when you need to test XML or HTML. So we probably just gonna exclude this for now. And I also included some summary on the responses. Ideally, this responses information should be in API documentation. Unfortunately, this is not here. So I just tried to summarize with what we usually expect to see. So in case we make a successful call, the very common status code to get is 200. In case there are some sort of errors, we get back correct status codes as well. So for example, 401 means unauthorized, and that's exactly what we are getting here when we are not logged in. And then we may get all kinds of other 400s in case we're trying to make the request that is incorrect, and that's expected behavior. Or in case there is a server kind of bug, we will be getting 500s. That's possible, but in case we actually ever see something like this, keep in mind that we should file a bug and we should tell about it to our developers so they can fix it. So let's start doing our testing. And I want to be just creating test cases as we go. So we can try to basically define what behavior we expect to see for certain APIs, for certain API calls, and then we can also just test it right away. So it's a very good practice in general to start with all kinds of happy pass test cases, right? So the first things that we cover in testing usually are positive functional tests that will verify that the main functionality works, right? We can do the exact behavior that we expect it to do, and we get back the correct response. So if we just think overall, right, about the functionality that this API provides, the main feature here is the ability to get the buzzer information. So the first test case would be to make an API call with totally correct parameters and verify that this API call actually returns the buzzer. So that's exactly what we just did before we started to make sure that everything works. That's a good start overall. And let's just make this call one more time. So it's just get open buzzer map, send it. And when we make this call, we get back the correct information. So this is going to be our first call. And the test case here, test case number 1, would be something like this. Successfully retrieve weather information or existing city, right? So this is our first test case. Expected result here. First of all, we should get back the status code, which is 200. I'm just going to say code. Now, besides the status code, just make this a little bit bigger. Besides the status code, we should obviously get the data, right? The most important information here is the weather information. So we should get back the correct response body. And also, if we just read some information about parameters, there is the ability to get information, to get weather temperature in different ways. So the default one is standard, and the temperature that we get first should be in standard units. So we can just put this information here. Now, in order to test this API, we actually don't need to do anything specific, right? So we don't actually have to even provide some additional information on what to provide here. And basically, you can either say something like only provide app ID and city ID, or you can just keep this empty, and that will be totally valid because, again, we're just making the first call with the correct, basically, ID and app ID, and that's it. Now, we can also, at this point, say that the test case has passed. Because in our case, when we just executed it, it was totally behaving as expected, right? And the weather was returned. Now, let's get back to this API and let's take a closer look at the response buyer. So when I make this call, I can see that status code is 200. That's good. Time is okay, right? Time 380 milliseconds is a bit too slow. Usually it's recommended to have responses within 200 milliseconds, but it's still acceptable. It's not too long. Now, the important part here is to make sure that we have the correct body information. So we get back the correct coordinates, weather, and also all kinds of other information. Obviously, it's a little bit hard to verify that the data that we get back is totally correct. One piece of information, like coordinates, for example, we can try to grab this from our list of cities. So, for example, if I search for the city, this has the coordinates, right? You can see that the city coordinates data is the same as what we see here. Right? So this is something that we can verify that is correct. We can also verify some information like country, there's some additional ID and so on, but we can't verify that the weather information is totally correct. Unfortunately, that happens sometimes. If you ever need to test a service similar to this, what I would recommend you to do, you can just Google the weather for a certain city and basically like cross-verify it with some other service to make sure that the weather data that you get back, right, is correct. So clear, clear sky, temperature, and so on, right? You can just try to Google this information and make sure that it actually matches to what we see. So that's basically it. This is how we test APIs. And if it's a GET call, we will be just making this call and verifying that the information that is provided back to us is totally correct. So another thing that we have here in the parameters is units, right? So units allow us to change basically the temperature, whether we want to get standard information or we want to temperature in Celsius or in Fahrenheit. We can actually clarify it by using units. And now, in my opinion, this is going to be our second test case. This is going to be the second, I guess, most popular flow for users is to use this API and actually specify the units that they want to use. Now, in order to basically make this API call, you basically we'll be doing totally the same thing as what we just did, but we will also provide the units, right? So we will add units to our API call and make sure that when we change units, the temperature changes in the correct way. So the second test case, right? Successfully retrieve weather information for an existing city. And now here we can say units standard. I'm just taking it from here. That's it, units set to standard. Now, we can actually do similar test cases here, right? Because there are three options, standard, imperial, or metric. So we can also keep on just creating our test cases. Over here, okay, that didn't work. All right, 3, 4. And the next test case and the one after it will be very similar. It just, in the second one, instead of the standard, let's put imperial. And now in the third one, let's just put metric. So expected result over here. And probably just copy here, by the way, I have a typo, standard. And expected result is very similar. It just we need to keep on changing units, right? So if we use imperial units over here to make an API call, our expected result will be the temperature in Celsius. I'm sorry, in Fahrenheit, imperial units. And for this one, for metric one, the temperature will be in Celsius. So we can just say temperature in metric units, right? And now we can just test these things and make sure that this works as expected. So let's see, parameters. The name of the parameter is units. Let's just copy that. Go to Postman. And here we can just, we are inside parameters tab. We can just add this parameter, so units. Now the first option was standard. I remember correctly. And now when I just paste it here, you can see that over here under the URL, it actually updates, and now we can see units equals standard in here. So when we make an API call, it basically should return us the same information as before, because in the documentation for this API call, it says that if you don't provide units, it will use standard. Standard is fallback here. So temperature and everything else looks about right. Now we can modify it. Let's change our units to imperial. By the way, I do it here in URL just because I get used to it, but you can just modify it here in the parameters and it will update in the URL. Let's send it. Now we can see that it's still the same city, coordinates look the same, this information totally is the same. Temperature changed, right? So we now see temperature in Fahrenheit. That makes sense. That actually seems like a very valid Fahrenheit temperature. And now another one is metric. So let's make this call and verify that temperature is also correct, right? So this is what we see. This is kind of cool. That's basically it. So at this point, we just verified another 3 cases, and those are the cases to verify that all different units work as expected. So let's go back to our API documentation, and let's just provide basically the information that all those test cases also passed, just another 3 test cases. Now, in here, by the way, something that you can provide under test details is basically just some clarification on what exactly you did. So I would also clarify that I'm providing units, and in here they are standard. In here I set units to metric, I'm sorry, to imperial. And over here, I set units, sorry. Right, so that's basically what we do. Not sure what happened to the formatting here. Okay, right, so this is basically how we can just test the happy pass test cases. Now, another thing that we can do here is we can add one more parameters, which is length, right? Length is for language. By the way, on Weather API, there is a whole documentation on how to pass this parameter. I also added this link, so it's easier to find. But if you click on it, it will take you to this page that basically tells you what is the parameter and what are languages that are supported, and basically which languages you can provide here. So in our case, it would be important to verify that language also works. I probably wouldn't test every one of these languages right now, although if that would be like a real website I'm working on, I would probably verify them all one by one. But today, just for demo purposes, let's just pick a couple. So let's, for example, use French and test for that. So let's go back to our documentation and let's create the next test case, which is, let's say, successfully retrieve weather information for an existing city. And in here, we can just clarify language, French, and sorry, something didn't. Oops. Okay, 1 second. Language. There we go. And same idea, right? We expect to get correct status code, correct response body, and now we also expect French. Sorry, French. And response. I'm just saying the response. That's good enough. Okay. I keep on changing the wrong. I keep on changing the wrong test case. Actually. Let me just update it back one more time. I don't know why Google is doing that to me. Here we go. All right, so French language in the response. Okay, and obviously we can just add a clear parameter. So let's say language, set it to French, for example. So let's go back to our test case. Let's get rid of units right now. Let's pass another parameter, language length. And again, I'm just taking this name, the name of the parameter from my documentation, and this is it, right? It's documented on the website. I'm not passing it as a language. I'm not passing it as just L. I'm passing the parameter exactly as it says over here under documentation. Otherwise, the backend will just not work. Okay, and FR, right? That's basically what we set it to. So FR for French. Now let's hit enter and see what we get back. So obviously the same city, right? City persists. That's good. Temperature in standards units. That's also good. That's what we expect because we don't pass any units. And you can see the description now has changed. It looks like French to me. Everything else pretty much looks the same, but definitely the French setting actually changed something. And then we can try something else, right? There are a lot of languages supported. Let's go for Russian, just for fun. So I'm not going to document this test case, but just to show you the difference, let's provide RU and also hit enter. Right, so we see the description in Russian letters. So that's basically how we can keep on testing this API. Obviously, there are a lot of different things that you can verify, and it's a very good thing to also verify the combination of parameters. So another test case that I want to make and I want to document is that when we make a call and we provide both parameters, language and units, they don't break each other and they actually still work and we still get back the correct information. So let's see. Next test case, still the happy pass one. Let's make sure that we can successfully retrieve weather information for an existing city. Let's give our French language, but we also, let's provide the units. So units set to metric. And this will allow us to verify that the combination of 2 parameters will still work and will not break an API, right? So we set the language to French and units. Here we go. Let's make this test case, units metric. Let's go back to French and let's hit enter. Right, so at this point, you can see that the language stays, it's correct. And we also see the weather temperature here, right? So this is clearly Celsius, and it means that this parameter also works, right? So everything looks like it's working fine. I would definitely play a little bit more with these parameters. You can combine, for example, Imperial and like another language and just see, make sure that things are working as expected. But on the high level, that's basically what you can do in order to make sure that things are working as expected. All right, now the next thing that I want to do here, and as I continue my testing, is I want to keep on verifying all kinds of things related to this API. And at this point, we pretty much covered most of the happy path test cases, right? We verified that we can get the faster information. We verified that we can get it correctly with different units, with different languages. Now, it's time for us to try to break it a little bit and try to verify that this API works as expected in case we are doing something that we are not supposed to be doing. So the first thing that makes sense to cover, just from logic perspective, is app ID. So app ID is the secured key that a user has to provide in order for this API to work. And basically, app ID allows us to hide our APIs from users who are not existent in our system, for users who did not register for our website. And it's very critical for us to make sure that if app ID is missing, we don't show any data, because otherwise our APIs are public to anyone and everybody can use them, and we don't get user data back, or people can use them for free. We don't want this to happen, right? So it's important for us to make sure that if app ID is not provided, we don't get back any information. Let's document this. By the way, these few test cases also passed, so we can say pass here, and we can also say pass. All right, I forgot to update the expected result, by the way, for units. So app ID, right? Finally, let's verify that we cannot retrieve the information if app ID is not provided. So we can say something like this: not if app ID provided. Right. So this is the next thing that we want. Fine. Now, if app ID is not provided, the expected status code is 401. That is documented, I think, over here. Yes, over here under their API errors on their website. It basically says if you did not specify API key, you should get back 401. So that's what we're going to say in our result. And test details, how to test, it's pretty clear, right? We should not provide app ID. You can clarify here to not provide app ID, but in my opinion, it's pretty clear from this test case. You don't have to do it. So we can just go to our Postman and modify this URL, right? So in Postman, it's very easy. You can either just delete the whole parameter, or you can just click on this checkbox and it will just turn off the parameter. You can see it disappears from the URL. And let's just make this call. And when we send it, we get back the status code 401, and we also get back this JSON, which says code 409 and the message invalid API key. Now, this is a typo, right? It should say code with E. So I would actually file this as a bug. And I would mention this to the developers. This is not something critical. This is probably more like a P2 kind of thing, but it would be nice to make sure that whatever developers send back in the APIs actually makes sense, right? So this test case, I would just basically mark as failed, and I would put the link to the bug ticket for this particular issue. Now, let's just go to Google Chrome, and I will just create a new document and will document this bug for us so we can actually see how we report bugs. So let me just go to my drive and create a new document. Let's see. All right, and I just opened the new document. And in here, let's just say, here we can just file all kinds of issues that we get back, right? So in our case, when we file the bug reports, we usually use Jira. So the process of filing bugs for APIs is actually very simple. It's, in fact, it's much simpler than doing that for actual manual testing. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to provide the title of the ticket. So I'm just going to say this is going to be our bug number 1. And the title of this ticket would be, let's go back to see what we get. Typo in the word code, right, when we get back the response. So and obviously, this is not very clear where exactly we get this code, right? Where exactly we get this word. And I would probably just say something like this: 401 response body. Our code has a typo. So whoever is trying to fix it understands that this body appears when we have 401 response. And now this is basically our title. Now in here, we can provide steps. So steps will be very simple. We basically need to clarify the method, which is get, and say what exactly we're doing. So just copy this URL. And actually, we don't even need to provide, I think, units and metrics. We can probably just remove them. Yep, we can just do this. It's enough. So So basically what we're saying to developers that they need to make a get to this URL, you can see that it doesn't include an app ID, and they can just observe and see the error message. And now our expected, I don't know why it changes the text format. Let's just go back to Arial. So our expected message in this case, let's just copy and paste. And our actual unexpected, I'm sorry, is code. So that's it. You can also add description if you want to this ticket, but description will be pretty much the same as our title. So basically, calling an API without app ID, returns response, it's any word code, that's a typo. Here we can even clarify code. Right, if you want to be very detailed, also that's not very common for API bug reports. So that's basically it. That's how you file a ticket. And one thing that you can also do here, just to attract more attention to basically like expected and actual difference, you can also just get rid of the full body. You can just basically concentrate on the one particular key that has a typo. That's it. And that will just make it basically. You can file this bugs to Jira, and usually when we file bug tickets related to backend, we use totally the same system, and very often it's even the same project as when we file the regular bugs for our project, so it's going to be the same Jira, and usually the same Jira project. So that's it. That's basically how you file bugs. This is obviously a very small one. I would probably give this one a low priority, so in my case, this probably would be something either P3, yeah, probably P3, or low priority. So that's it. I hope it makes sense. I will also attach this bug ticket to our slides. Okay. Let's continue and let's get back to our API documentation. So obviously here we can attach the link to our bug report, right? But to be fair, this being said, typos in the API responses or things like this are not very likely to be fixed quickly. Very often developers don't really care much about those. Okay, so let's continue and let's do some more testing. First negative test case, right? We can't retrieve buzzer information if app ID is not provided. Okay, got it. Now, another thing that you can do here is you can try to get a buzzer information, but provide invalid app ID. So for example, provide the app ID of a user that didn't verify their email, that should also return for one. Or you can provide app ID in invalid format. So for example, we can just cut half of it, send, and it should still be returning for one to us. So there are a lot of cases that you can do here. I'm not going to document them all. It's just getting too detailed. But instead, I would usually put something that is pretty generic. And basically, for these cases, I would just provide the whole group and say something like, cannot retrieve buzzer information if app ID is invalid. And then, sorry, if app ID is invalid. And then here, obviously, the expected result is also code 401. And in this case, we can probably just copy the execution result from before and just connect it to the same bug report, basically saying that the error message isn't correct. Now, okay, we got app ID covered, right? So we understand that app ID actually must be there. API works as expected. If it's incorrect or is not provided, it returns for one. Now, let's keep on trying to break it. So the next thing that we have to provide in this API in order for it to work is this ID. And again, I'm taking it from our documentation, right? Is a required parameter. It has to be there. So on their website, if you just look under parameters, you can see that most app ID and ID of the city are required. And without that, API should not work at all. So let's just try not providing ID and see how API behaves in this case. Now, I would guess that we should get back 400 or 404 status code. 400 means that we are doing something correctly from client side. 404 means that something's not found. This documentation is not good enough. It doesn't cover this case. So it's a little bit hard to say just from reading this documentation what code exactly we're supposed to get. So let's just try and see what exactly this API is doing. But in any way, the important part here is that the data will not be received, right? And we should get back not 500, but 400 something. All right, so let's see. Test case number 9, cannot retrieve buzzer information if is not provided. Now, another test case that is very similar, and we can probably document it over here right away, is that we should not be able to retrieve buzzer information if city ID is invalid. And then another test case that I would probably add as its own line over here, be able to retrieve buzzer information if ID is 0. This is just a specifics of API testing, but sometimes when APIs expect some parameter that comes as a digit, testing 0 actually makes a lot of sense, because when you put 0 instead of a digit that API expects, you see all kinds of dark magic in APIs. This is just based on my experience, and developers very often make mistakes with that, so I would just verify that. If CDID is set to 0, the API still works, we still get something consistent with the rest of the API behavior. All right, now let's try to get buzzer information and not provide the CDID. So let's get back here. Okay, we have app ID, we have a regular ID. Let's turn it off. So I'm disabling it, right? It's no longer here. We only have app ID, and let's make it call. Send. So we get back 400. That request also has a typo, but that's probably just global to all the error messages on this website. And the message says nothing to geocode, which makes sense. In my opinion, this is exactly what this API should be doing, right? So status code 400, we get back no weather information. So we expect to get back code 400. And obviously, one thing that we can probably even add here as well is that no weather information return. Right, that we don't get any weather information in case there is an error. So we can probably just modify those test cases as well, just to be a little more explicit. And here, the same situation, right? Okay, so that's basically it. In the comments, like on how to test this, you can basically either clarify that you want the ID to be removed, or you don't have to do it because again, the title of the test case is very self-explanatory. But then here, we can basically mark this test case as passed or failed. In this case, it also has the same bug, but overall the whole thing is working. So I'm just gonna mark this one as passed. Because like we already basically documented the bug, we have the link for it. In this case, that bug is just global. It doesn't make sense to mark everything else as failed because of that. But overall, the functionality is there, right? So we see that the whole thing is actually working, and we get back 400. If you want to be consistent and like because of a typo mark all kinds of test cases failed, you can do that. I usually try to avoid it, but it's really like up to you. There are no good recommendation to do here. Now, another thing that I mentioned is that would make sense for us to try to test app ID. I'm sorry, city ID. That is just in our case invalid, right? So something that doesn't basically follow the right format. So in our case, we can just go back to Postman and we can just try to modify this ID and provide something that is totally incorrect, right? Invalid format. So let's set it to ABC, for example. And in our test case, we can also document this. So we can just set city ID to ABC. And when we make this API call, we should get back something with a valid message, right? You can see that it also works. We get back 400, and it basically provides a valid error message saying that this is not a city ID, right? So we can actually go back here. We can probably just document it as well. And now another test case is to try to get a weather information and provide the ID that is set to 0. So let's do this. And we get back 400 message invalid ID. And now one more test case that actually will make sense to do here. Is we can also try to get information for the city ID with a valid format, but the city that doesn't exist on this list. You can see that this list has a bunch of different IDs, but you can definitely come up with basically a 6-digit combination that's not a valid ID, or 7-digit combination that is not a valid ID on this website. In order to do that, you should probably just try to guess or look through this documentation and try to find one. Let's just try to guess in our case. So in the test case, we can say something like cannot retrieve weather information. City ID does not exist on the list. Yes. Right, so I would expect here to get something similar to 0, but let's just try to make this API call. So let's just modify this ID. In the case of 0, it told us that it was invalid ID. I tried to, just out of curiosity, it already tells us that city is not found, right? So we get back 404. If I try 1, same idea. I also get 404 and city not found, right? So this is a very interesting inconsistency because in my case, like when I provide 0, I would guess that 0 should return totally the same errors, right, as 1 or 2, and we should get back 404, city not found, but 0 actually returns 400. That's just an interesting difference in API behavior. Probably not a bug. Probably there's a logic in the code that does that explicitly, but in any way, just a good test case to try. So 2, right, returns code 404 and city not found. All right, makes sense. So ID set to 2 gets us back gets us back status code 404, and we also don't get back any better information return. So similar idea as we go, we can just mark this test case as passed. Right? And those are very, very common test cases that cover a lot of those things, right? At this point, it would pretty much cover most of the functionality of this API. We verified that the very parameters work as expected. When we tried to break this API, we still got back a very legit status code telling us about the error. Also, the error message that is being returned, right? City not found, and so on, like all the other ones. Sometimes people even document them under expected results. So if you have time, feel free to do that. I usually don't do that very often because they change a lot. But in any way, when we were doing our testing, we clearly saw that error messages are totally correct. So things actually make sense, except for one tiny typo. All right, so there are a few more things that we can actually do with this API in order to try to break it. At this point, we were pretty much just working with these parameters, ID, app ID, and we were trying to basically break them, make them invalid, and so on. Now, keep in mind that there are also additional parameters that we used before. So, for example, there was a parameter for language, and it also needed to have a certain format. Now, we can also try to break our call, and we can provide all kinds of invalid values here. So, for example, if I say something like French, that should not work because here this website, when we go to the language information, those and only these ones are the valid codes, right? So in our case, if we say something like French, that should not modify the language, and you can see that it actually doesn't modify the language. The language just falls back to English by default. So that's another thing that we can also test here. Not going to spend too much time on documentation, but just to show you some test cases. Now, besides that, we also can try to set it to something that it's not supposed to do, let's say 0, and see how it behaves. That works. Besides that, we also have another parameter for units. Let's set it to another invalid value and see how it behaves. Okay, it obviously doesn't apply metric, it's fallbacks to default one, so that's expected. And this is basically how you test APIs, especially get calls. If they have multiple parameters, just try to play with them, try to break them. It's pretty easy to do this through Postman. You can keep on modifying them and basically keep on breaking this whole API. Besides this, there are a few more things that you can usually verify when you work with APIs. And one of those things is that you have to have a certain method. For example, if this API is a get API, you shouldn't be able to make post API or put API or patch API call to this URL. So one thing that you can do with Postman, you can modify the method. And then when you make an API call, you should get back a correct status code telling you that you cannot make this call. So let's document this one, just because it's a whole different category. And so you have an example. So I can say something like this. Cannot a call the endpoint. Now, I haven't found what's the correct error code should be in here. Like under their documentation, I don't see proper error codes. So I suggest you just make this call and see what information we get back. But ideally, if something like this happens, common status codes for that would be 4 or 5. That's what people usually return, but it should be 400 something. And obviously, we should not get any weather information. We should just get some sort of error message back. So put is just an example. You can try multiple: put, patch, get, post, and just make sure that none of them work. So let's replace our get with put, and let's just hit enter to make this call. And here we go. We get internal error. This is an alarm error message, but then we get back correct status code 4 or 5 telling us that this method is not allowed, right, for this particular URL. So this API is behaving as expected. Put doesn't happen. Good. Now let's play more. Let's do delete, for example. Also 4 or 5. Let's try to do post. And all of a sudden, post actually worked. So I would talk to developers about this, right? Because if that's supposed to be get API to only get information, a post should not be allowed. Now let's go back to our APIs and let's actually document this. So let's keep on counting over here. So code, this was 4. So code is 4 or 5, this is what we expect. And now let's just create a few similar test cases. So we cannot make a put, we cannot make a delete, we cannot make a patch. I don't know if we tried patch or not, we can try it really quickly too. Also 4 or 5. And the last word that I had, sorry, is we cannot make a post call. All right, and for this tree, we got the correct behavior. For the post one, we didn't get the correct behavior. So the last one will be marked as fail. And here we will need to provide the link to the bug that basically we will find. So again, this API only supports get. So get works as expected. Modifying this method should result in 4 or 5, but in our case, when I modify and change it to post, it results in 200. So it actually returns information instead of 4 or 5. So in my case, I can just go and file this as a bug. So let's go back to our bugs. And here we can just say our bug number 2. Can probably even separate them. And our bug number 2 will be basically that our post method should not be allowed when calling. And in here, we usually provide the endpoint. So this is the endpoint. So / data 2.5 buzzer. And now we can just basically try to put some description in here. So our bug report is more complete. So description. Very similar, right, to basically our title. So in this case, basically, what we're saying is that we should only allow methods to be used when getting a buzzer by ID. And steps to reproduce will be just basically very similar to the ones above, but this time we just say that we do post, and we just provide the URL where we made this call. So after we do this post, by the way, we don't care about units here. So after we do this post, we can just say post and observe. Then we say 200. And our expected is 4 or 5, but actual is 200, right? So again, if we have a certain method documented, only that method should be allowed. And allowing making post calls against endpoints that we're supposed to get is a little bit risky because when we make post calls, we can also try to send some data, and that can potentially be a reason for actually breaking that API. So that's our bug number 2. And again, usually we would just file it in Jira, and in our test cases, when we execute them, we can just attach the link. Now, that's pretty much it. There is one last thing that we can try to do right now. This is not a very common thing to do when you test get endpoints, but because we found this problem, because we found out that this particular bug exists, we can now try one thing that usually can break post calls, and that is generating a large piece of data and sending that to our endpoint and see basically how it handles it, how our server manages to survive or not. So again, if we just use get over here, we basically just get information. Now you can see that this request does not have a body. Now if we do post, we can actually pass the body to this API call, and our server will try to analyze it, because when post is being used, server usually try to analyze the data that is being sent. So what we can do, we can just send a JSON piece of data using our post method. Now at this point, it doesn't really matter what we send. We are just curious what's going to happen and if that will break something on this website. So I'm just going to go and look for a JSON data generator. All right. And this is a cool website that allows you to generate large pieces of data. So when I click generate, it will generate this. So I can select it, the whole thing, right? So I can just use it. And after I just copied this, I can go back to Postman and I can paste it. And in order to make it even more aggressive, I can just keep on pasting it, right? So there are like multiple rows of data, about 7,000 rows already. And now we can just try to make this API call. So you can see that when I do this, it works. API call still handles this, right? Our server still returns the right information. But look at the timing, right? You can see that the time here is almost 1 second. Now, if I just take out this whole data and make this API call, you can see that the time here is a little bit different, right? If I make the get call, you can see that time changes to 94 milliseconds, right? So when I make the change from get to post, time is increasing a little bit here. When I paste this data, time keeps on increasing even more. And now if I keep on pasting like even more data, you will notice that the time keeps on increasing a little bit after a little. So what this means, it means that the server is actually trying to process this request. And if you keep on increasing this load, if you keep on increasing the data, there is a possibility that you may hit the situation when you may even overload the server, or you may make the server work on this particular request for a pretty long time. And now if a lot of these requests are being generated, requests like this, and sent to the server at the same time, this is one of the ways to put the server down. So this is one of the things that hackers can do in order to break our website. So it doesn't seem like a very hard, like a very complex issue, right? That we only allowing the wrong method to be used, but that may lead to pretty huge problems. And that's something that I would definitely recommend developers to fix. Obviously, this issue is not user specific. So the priority here would be really just up to developers and discussing things with developers. But because potentially that could lead to the fact that we can break something, I would usually bring this issue up with developers. By default, I would usually give this ticket medium priority. But sometimes after the conversation with developers, they raise this priority and make it more of a high. So that's basically it. That's how we test an API. I hope it was interesting. I hope it wasn't too boring. All the information, all these test cases that we've created today, all the bug reports are available for you. So if you go to this slide, you will find the links with the test cases and bug report examples. I encourage you to try this all yourself. And also, as I mentioned, this current weather API has tons of different APIs. You can try to find city weather information by zip code. You can try to play with different cities and different IDs. Obviously, today we only took one city, but there are a lot of different cities that you can try. And try to practice with this yourself. So after you test it with a couple of APIs like this, you will definitely be very familiar. Today we've covered pretty much everything related to testing a GET API. And during our next lesson, we will spend more time during hands-on testing. And next time we will be testing post APIs. So I'll see you soon. And bye-bye, everyone. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Welcome back to API testing course. So today's going to be our lesson number 4, and we will continue API testing. Today we will spend some time doing post API testing. Last time we took a look at our get call. Today we will try to make a few post calls, and we will verify that the API is working as expected. Before we start, just a few words about testing a post API. Last time when we were testing a get call, the main goal of our testing was to make sure that we get back the correct information and that our API still works with different parameters and the information that is being returned is actually correct. Now, when we test something that allows to send information and not just to get it, we have some additional things that we need to verify. So when we do the testing of the post API call. Besides just verifying that we get back the correct response, we get back the correct information, we also need to do a lot of testing related to the payload itself. When we make a post call, we are sending the information to our backend, to our server, and every time we send some information, it's usually being sent as key and the value. We always need to do the field validation, right? So for example, if you are trying to register a user and send user email to the backend, your API should actually validate that email that you are sending is a valid email. Very similar to manual testing, right? When we try to create the user, we usually make sure that we can only do it when we provide correct email, valid password, valid first name, last name, and so on. So the same type of validation we are doing in API testing as well. And when we send information to the server side, we need to validate the fields. So if we send an empty email, our API obviously should return us an error message and explain what exactly we are doing incorrectly. Besides that, if we are missing some fields, for example, we're trying to register a user, but we don't provide an email, this should also be basically captured by the server side, and server side should provide us back with the correct error message and basically not allow user creation in this case. Besides this, when we make an API call and we send an information, this information is always sent in the proper format. So in your API documentation, for example, you will be able to see how you're supposed to send an information. If it's an email, it should be sent as a string, right? You can't just send email using only digits or something like that. So when we make a test case for a post call, we always validate the data type. So if a certain parameter is only allowed to be sent as a string, we have to make sure, we have to test right, and we have to make sure that the server, when getting this parameter in a wrong, invalid format, will also return us the correct error message. Besides that, when we make a post call, we also sending a payload, and this payload can go in invalid format. So our server, if receiving payload in invalid format, should actually handle that situation and should also show us some error message saying you're doing something wrong, your JSON is not correct. And if we send all kinds of large payload, server should also be ready to handle those. So if somebody is trying to intentionally break that API with a large payload, server should return a correct error message and not process that large payload. So that's basically it. Those are the specifics of testing all API calls that allow you to send some information. So besides post, methods like put or patch will also have these features. So if you ever need to test any kind of API call that requires sending a payload besides just the URL and native parameters, always make sure to validate for those things. And today we will do exactly that. Today we will test a post API call, and we will test for all these things. Now, before we start, just a few words about what we're going to do today. We will actually take a real life API. I'm going to steal a real life production API from this website. It's calm.com. And we will be doing testing against this one. So the example is very close. It's actually identical to what you see usually implemented on real websites or mobile apps. And in order to steal some information, in order to steal an API call from this website, we will be using Chrome Developer Tools. So Chrome Developer Tools is a very powerful tool. It has the ability to display all the API calls that your website is making. So if you ever need to test an app, like a web app that is making API calls, and for some reason you don't know the payload of this API, you don't have the documentation, from Chrome Developer Tools, you can just find the call that is being made, and you can always just copy this call, right, and import that to your Postman. And by doing that, you can basically populate the call that your website is making to your Postman and do the testing using Postman afterwards. Today, I will be testing calm.com. I don't work for this company, and I don't have access to their internal documentation of their APIs. So in order to test their APIs, at first, I will try to steal those APIs from their website, and I will show you how I do that. And then after we are able to capture those APIs, we will do our testing. Keep in mind that Chrome Developer Tools is a very helpful tool, and when you work as a manual QA engineer, I highly recommend you to use Chrome Dev Tools network in order to see the communication between the backend of your app and the client side of your app, so you can make sure that everything is working as expected. All right, so this being said, we are ready to start our testing, and let's just go to the website. So I have this page open. This is just calm.com website. I just navigated to calm.com. And at this point, I can create the free account, and that's what I want to do first. So I'm just going to click on this free button, skip for now. And from here, I can basically go to this form. So this is just the sign up form for calm.com. And from this page, you can actually create an account. And the first API that we will be testing is a sign up API, which is super common. It's just an API for user creation or user registration. And in case of this website, they basically just ask you to provide your first name, right, your email, and your password. And then when you basically click continue, you will be able to create your profile. So I'm gonna generate email first because I want to use my own. In order to do this, I have this website for fake email generation, email-fake.com. This is just a website where you can generate fake email for testing. I'm gonna click on this button, generate a new email. It will generate the email address for me. Now I can just copy that, go back to calm.com sign up form, and here I can just paste this email. Now first name, I'm just gonna enter Lana, and I'm gonna create a super secured password old password with an exclamation point. And over here on the right side, I already have Chrome Developer Tools network open, so I will be able to see all the API calls that that page is making. In order to open Chrome Developer Tools, you can always just click on the, basically do the right click on your web page using Google Chrome browser, go to inspect. And after you do this, you can click on this network tab. So this is the tab that is responsible for all the API calls. So in this tab, you will see all the API calls that this web page is making. Now, very often when you navigate from one page to another, this tab actually don't save the information that was requested on the previous page. So in order to force our Chrome Developer Tools to keep the information, just enable this preserve log button over here, checkbox over here. So when it is on, all the API data will be recorded, and you will be able to see pretty much everything, even if you navigate away from the page. All right, so before I click continue button, I'm just going to click on this icon to clean all the API calls, because again, I don't know which API call this page will make in order to create this user. So in order to find it in an easier way, I'm just going to retrieve all the past data, and now I'm just going to click continue. All right, so we can see on the right side there are a lot of API calls being made. Now we can just scroll through all these calls. You can see that it's requesting a lot of information, and we can try to find the one that kind of looks about right and just makes sense to us on the high level. At this point, I don't really see an API that tells me something about sign up. So let's just close this to skip it, and probably we will see that call after this. Okay, and now let's just keep on looking through the API calls that this page was making and try to find the one that makes the most sense to us and resembles as the sign up call. Obviously not very easy. Over here, we have this filter functionality. We can look for register, we can look for sign up here. Let's see. If I do sign up, actually it filters out a few APIs. This one looks about right. This is a post call. Yep, here we go. It was made over here in the middle of everything else. It's a post call to calm.com API/sign up. And over here, I can see that the payload is totally right? So this sign up call to register a user has the correct payload. It has the email that I entered, and it also has the correct password. So keep in mind that if you don't have an API documentation, just trying to do something like this as a website, it sometimes takes time to find this API call. And if you are looking for an API, just basically keep on reading through this line and look for a call that makes the most sense. Usually the name of the endpoint, at least a little bit, reflects what API is doing, and sign up or register usually is used for user registration or user creation. All right, so at this point, this is the call, and it was made with this payload. So we can try to copy it. I'm gonna do the right click on it over here. I'm gonna go to copy, and over here, I'm just gonna copy this curl over here. So curl or CURL is just a very common format for sending APIs. So if I copy that over here, I can then go to Postman, and I can import this basically in Postman. So in Postman, I can click on this import button, raw text, and over here, I can just paste everything that I just copied. So I'm just hitting Command V or Control V for Windows users. And then over here, I can just click continue, import, and that will import this call into my Postman. So now I can see everything that was sent when I made this API call. Let me just format it a little bit. Command B, by the way, will format that in a nice way. And over here, we can see that this is the URL. This is the body of this call. And if I hit the send button, it will make another call, and it will try to sign up. Obviously, that shouldn't work because this user is already registered, but now we have the copy of this API. Now let's do the testing and verify all kinds of things for the sign up functionality. I already created a document for us, so we can save some time. In the presentation, this button over here will take you to test cases. And this is the document that will open when you click on this button. And in here, I already populated the information about the API that we will be testing with some expected basically results. And I already created the list of test cases just to save time. So we can go over them and do our testing. Today, we're going to test two things. At first, we're going to test the user sign up using this API. And after that, we will also test user logging using Calm logging. So that's what we are going to do. All right, user creation API, base URL, api.com.com, endpoint /sign up. I'm just taking this information from here. All right, /sign up, and this is our base. Now, payload basically is what we see over here. Email and password are required. I already played with this API a little bit just to find out what it does. Name is an optional parameter that you can send when you register. Also, is college is another optional parameter that they use upon user creation. We're not going to test this one, just going to only play with email, password, and name. But keep in mind that when you have many parameters upon login, ideally you should test every one of them. One is enough for, just for example, that we have today. but feel free to test the additional parameters yourself. Now, responses, right? If we try to sign up and register successfully, we expect to get back 200 status code, and we also expect to get back the information about our user. You can find this under the response over here. Actually, it's not shown in my Postman, but you will see it when we make an API call. And then every time you try to sign up with invalid parameters or with something that is not expected, you get back the error and some sort of 400, 405, those are the responses I've seen. If there is something wrong with the server, we would probably get back 500, but keep in mind that if we ever get back 500, that's a backend bug, and we always report them to Jira. All right, so at this point, we can start our testing. We are ready. And let's just think about the test cases first. So as I mentioned during the last lesson, every time we test something, we always start with positive functional testing first. So the first test case would be to create a valid user, right, to do the actual valid sign up, and to verify that this user can be successfully created. So this is just the first thing that we need to do. Now, as I mentioned, email and password are required parameters. So the first test case would be to verify that we can create a user and only provide email and password. And if we do that, everything works. Name is an optional parameter. So another test case would be to create a user, provide email, password, and name, and verify that this user can also be created. And we don't see any errors with that. Now, if there are additional parameters, right, for example, like this one is college, the third test case would be to verify that we can provide all these parameters and the user will be successfully created if we do that. So don't forget to verify this combination of the parameters. If parameter is optional, it's important to test without it to verify that things are still working. Is college and name are optional parameters. So at first, I'm going to remove them from the payload. Now, in order to register a user, I need to use some email and password. I've already used that one on the real website, right, in order to grab this sign up API. So I'm going to modify this email a little bit. So let's just change the email domain. Let's say it's gmail.com. And the password, I'm just going to say password with exclamation point. And that's basically the first test case, right? We should be able to do the post to this endpoint with a valid payload. This is our payload. And when we send it, everything should work as expected. So let's do this call. And we can see that if we are registering this user, we get back status 200. The user gets successfully created. This is the email. Email is correct, right? So the payload has the correct information. We also get back the token. Token will be used for all kinds of in-app APIs, and we will take a look at it a little bit later. And then we also have some additional data. Was created set to true. Sounds about right. Language is English. Email confirmation status unconfirmed. I haven't verified this email. Has opted in limited data use, also set to false. It looks like some sort of marketing or some data confirmation that we haven't signed up yet, right? So we can successfully create a user by making this API call, and everything works as expected. So this test case would be passed. Now, the second test case, as I mentioned, would be to do the same thing, but keep on adding optional parameters. So one parameter that we have over here is name, and we can also provide name as a parameter during our registration. So we can now modify this payload a little bit, add name, and provide some sort of valid name. Now, again, this email is obviously already registered, so we can modify it a little bit too. Just modify this email address and make a send call. And we can see that when we provide the name, user is also created, status code 200, name, email is here, they are correct, right? We also are given back user ID, so everything looks pretty good, so this test case would also be passed, right? Another test case would be provide this is college flag that we've seen at the beginning and verify that we can create a user like that. So if you want to do that yourself, you can try that too. Now, one thing that I see here is that time actually is not very fast, right? So you can see that it actually takes almost half a second to create a user. That's a bit too long. So that is something that I would probably bring up to the developers. It's not necessarily a bug, but it's just something that makes sense to discuss because users are not going to sit and wait until our APIs like working on the website, and over half a second for just a user creation is a bit long. All right, so let's continue. Now, duplicated users should not be created, right? That's another totally valid test case for user registration. If we have a user, we shouldn't be able to register a duplicate user with the same email. So in order to test this, the only thing that we need to do is just send the same API call again with the same email. We can modify password, we can keep it the same, and modify name or keep it the same, it doesn't matter. But email should always be unique, right? So if I try to do this call again, let's just send. Here we go, we get back an error message, email taken, and we get back 400. This is actually a very good response, right? It's a very clear error message telling us what exactly we are doing wrong. And usually on the client side, if user is trying to do something like this, you would see some error message saying like your user has been registered. If you forgot your password, go here, right? So this is totally correct. Post user with the same payload 2 times, right? And we should get back 400. Now, after this, we can keep on doing all kinds of negative tests, and we can start playing with the payload itself. So obviously, if you are trying to register for a website, website should have some sort of limitations for the emails that you are creating, password requirements, and so on. Unfortunately, because we don't work for com.com, we don't know all the limitations that they have. But at the minimum, like standard thing that we expect from the website is that website should not let us register with invalid email. So if we just say email test@com, this is not a valid email format, so this should not be allowed. That's the first thing that we can try. So let's go back here. And let's just modify our email, say something invalid. Let's say test Gmail. We don't have to keep the name, but this parameter is optional, so it doesn't matter here. And now let's make a call. And we should get back the correct error message, and we see right that the server actually validates this email and returns us back this message saying email invalid. Now, honestly, if I'm testing something like this, I would try all kinds of things here. I would try to just send test. I would try to just say something like test at .com. So you can keep on playing with this parameter just to verify that in all these cases when you send something that is invalid, you get back the correct error message. And by invalid, we obviously expect at least invalid format, right? So test at aa.com is a valid format, but test at something without that over here is definitely invalid, or this is definitely invalid, or this is also invalid, or just this is also invalid, right? So you can keep on playing with this parameter. Thanks, Now, another parameter that we have here is a password. So if a website has any kind of limitations for passwords, we should be able to test it here. I was playing this on .com. The only limitation I found is that they don't allow you to use passwords that are too short. So 4 characters would be too short for them, for example. And now if I just enter something like this and try to register, it should return the error message telling me that the password is too short. So in this case, it works exactly as expected. So keep in mind that backend should always have these validations, right? If you are testing a website and your sign-up form has limitations. For example, password cannot be less than 5 characters. It should include uppercase, lowercase, and so on. The same validation should be on the backend. That's very critical. Now, name, we can also try to break it a little bit. We can try to send it as, let's say, digits. When playing with com.com, I honestly didn't find any kind of validations around name. But you can try it yourself. Maybe you'll find something. Obviously, name set to 1 in my ideal world is not acceptable, right? We should not be able to do something like this. So let's actually modify this email a little bit. But in my case, when I was trying to work with this website and do something like this, it just wouldn't, like it would just let me set anything I wanted to name. So they obviously don't have a limitation there. If your website has it, definitely test for it. In this case, doesn't look like it. So that's this category, right? All kinds of invalid parameters. Now, the next thing that we need to verify is that we cannot set our basically payload values to something that is blank, right? So for example, we cannot register a user and just provide an empty email, or we cannot register a user and provide an empty password. So this is another good thing to validate when you are testing something with post. So for example, let's just set email to something blank, make this API call, and you can see that if we are doing something like this, the response is 400 and we get back the information saying email is invalid. Another thing you can do, for example, you can fully delete a certain parameter, like for example, if I get rid of the password and make this API call, it tells me the password is invalid. Usually I would test for both. I would test a blank parameter like this, and then I would have another test case with just fully removed parameter, just to verify that in both cases, things are working as expected, right? So this is how we can validate that. Another thing that we should check when we make all kinds of APIs with payload is the data type. So when we pass parameters, we always have to pass them with the correct data type that is expected. And in our case, when we send email or password, this is a string. So everything that you see in double quotes, this is basically a string. Now, a good test case would be to try to send them, for example, integers, and verify that the API doesn't break and the API returns you back the correct error message, right? Besides that, you can try to send them as the Boolean value. So for example, you can say true. That's the Boolean value. It can be either true or false. And when you set that to something like this, this payload should also be processed by the server, and server should also return you back 400 and some error message saying your password or your email is invalid if you are providing invalid data. So this is very important, and this is, if we go back here, data types of values. So this is how we verify that data type, only allowed data type will work. Besides that, when we test APIs that include the payload, this payload should only be allowed to be sent in the format that this backend, like the server, expects. So in my case, for example, if I go here, I have payload set to JSON. So if I, for example, modify this format and set it to text, by the way, it also needs to be clarified in headers. In headers, I need to use content type text. So if I have a content type over here, JSON, I need to disable it. So content type is set to text over here by default. When I send it to this endpoint, server should try to basically either process it or return us some sort of error message in case it cannot process it, right? So in our case, if I send it as text, server still can process it, and it returns us a valid error message. So this is acceptable. Now, if we go to headers, and now, for example, turn off the text header, but enable JSON header, saying that we are sending this payload in the JSON format, but in fact, over here, under the payload itself, we have text. If we send it, server should also be able to handle the situation. And you can see that in this case, it's also able to provide us this error message. It's important here to see all kinds of 400s. If you ever see 500, that would be a bug, right? So in our case, server can still process things. It returns us 400, so things are working as expected. Now, besides that, server should have some validation for invalid formatting. And in case we are trying to send invalid JSON or any kind of invalid other data type, that should be handled. The way to do it is basically go to our payload over here and just modify the payload to back the email. So it is invalid. In order to make JSON invalid, you can do whatever you want. You can just take out one of these braces, or you can just take out a comma in the middle. You will see that Postman actually highlights that in red for you, basically telling you that something is not right. Or you can get rid of, let's say, a quotation mark over here after the string. And when you make an API call, a server should be able to process this, and it should be able to show you some error message. So I'm going to take it out, and then I'm going to make an API call. And you can see that actually server handles it, and it tells me that this JSON is invalid. So this behavior is also totally correct, and you can see that server doesn't break. The worst thing that I've seen just during my career was trying to send something like this. I think I was sending just this as a body, and the server was trying to find the keys, like basically email or password in that payload, and it wasn't able to find it. But instead of just giving up, it would keep on trying, and eventually it would just enter this endless loop. And at some point, it was just trying to work on it so hard that it would run into Stack Overflow issue, and the whole server would go down, right? So this is obviously not something the user would do in a normal case, but definitely if you have Postman and ability to test something like this, I highly recommend you to do it. The validation on the server side should be in place to protect our backend from somebody trying to break it. Obviously, if hackers would find out this vulnerability and this easy ability to put the whole website down by making one wrong sign-up call, that would be really bad for us, and it would take a while for our engineers to find the problem and bring this website up. So just keep in mind that it makes sense to do the payload, try to break payload in all kinds of ways. Now, besides that, when we test post calls, we also should be able to validate methods, right, that are not allowed. So if we try to make a get call to sign up, we should get back some sort of error message. In our case, it just says 404 not found, and it just returns some looks like HTML. If you look at the preview over here, you will actually see the error message cannot get on sign up. In my opinion, this is a little bit inconsistent, right? Like I would expect here to get status code 405. That's a very common status code in case we are doing the method that is not allowed. And I would expect to get back this error message in the same format as before, in basically JSON format saying error cannot get to this. But this was built this way. It's okay, right? As long as validation there and it is in place, that's acceptable. I disagree with status codes, but maybe developers of this website actually have this reasoning for using 404. It's totally up to them. Like from my perspective, as long as this validation is working and not allowing us to modify and do something weird, that's good enough. Okay, and the last thing that I usually recommend to test when you're working with posts, something that we've done the last time is to try to send a large JSON, so something that server cannot process or something that is very hard for server to process. And just to remind you, you can always do that by using a JSON generator. So if I just search for, JSON generator, over here on jsongenerator.com, I can just generate the giant payload, copy that, go to Postman, let's go back to my post, paste it over here, and try to send this information to our backend. So if I click send, the backend should handle it. Let's go back to this view, right? It says email is invalid, right? So it's trying to process it and it's trying to find the email for it. It tells that email is invalid and it returns us back 400. One thing that we can do here, actually, we can go back to the previous payload and insert this JSON into the previous payload, and basically put it in the middle of it. Just one thing to keep in mind is that we want to make sure that we follow the correct formatting. So in here, probably just get rid of this mail. Oops. We can just create like some additional parameter, for example, and then we can just set it, right? And over here, just gonna add a comma, right? So you can see that I'm basically like inserting another parameter, right? I just added this key JSON, which I just came up with, and everything that I added, I just pasted in here, separated by commas, because all the values in JSON should be separated by commas. And now email is there, right? This is a valid email. We also have password, and we also have this JSON parameter, so we can try to send it and see how server reacts. Actually, in this case, this user is being created, so that is an interesting behavior. I feel like this should not be allowed. looks like server is actually trying to process this. So I would probably just play with this a little bit longer. I don't really want to do it to to4 on their production website, but in testing environment, I would probably just play with this a little bit longer, try to insert something that is larger, maybe even set email to this, and see how it will try to process that. So something like this you can also do and try to play with this website. So that's how we can test a post API, and this is the API that allows us to sign up. Now, another thing that I want to show you is that besides sign up, another API call that is super famous and that is post is login. So login is usually done through post, and count.com also allows you to do logging, and in order to do it, we use post method. Their login is very simple. When you log in, you just enter email and password, and that's exactly what you need to send in the payload. And in order to log in, you just need to provide the valid parameters. Now, in order to find out this information, I obviously also stole that information from their website. So after you register as a valid user, you can always go to count.com. Let's log out. You can go to login. I already have an account login. Let me just clean up everything. And in here, you can just populate your login information. I don't remember what my email was. Let me try to use this one. I think I used many in order to register on this website. Password. So on this right side, I'm just going to delete all those APIs. Click login. Here we go. It logs me in. And now I just need to find this API that resembles me login one. So this is it. Here we go. So we can copy that. Copy as the URL. Go to Postman. Come here. Import row text. Just paste this curl over here. Import. Right. So this is the call. This is the body. Right. This is my wonderful email and password. Postman did modify my password for some reason. Password was this, I believe. And if we make this API call, send, we can see that it actually logs us in, right? So status code 200, name of the user, email, and so on. So in order to post login, we only use email and password as parameters. So in order to test this APIs, we will apply exactly the same logic as what we've done during the user registration. So we will try to log in these valid credentials first, right? The happy pass scenario or golden pass scenario, positive functional test case, that is the most common across the users, right? This is what I just did, and we will verify that the status code is 200. And then after that, the second test case is to try to log in with incorrect password, right? Something that users will do all the time, and we will verify that we get back the correct error message. And after that, we can try do all kinds of things and break it in any way. So things that I would test, I would verify that we cannot log in with an empty password. We cannot log in without password provided, right? We cannot make like basically this API call without email provided or with email that is invalid, like this, right? We cannot make this call and provide email with like data type, right? Should also not be allowed. The same with password, right? Should also not be allowed. And so on. We basically can keep on trying to log in with invalid credentials upon a certain limit escape. So for example, if your website has a certain attempts of login amount, so for example, if user is trying to log in more than 5 times and user doesn't provide the right password, we basically force user to reset the password. If that functionality is implemented, you can test that as well. So you can try to make this API call like 5 times in a row with incorrect password and see what information you get back eventually. In count.com, I usually start seeing some 403 issues if I work and try to provide a valid password for more than 7 times right now. But this is the current behavior. It's possible that by the time you are watching the scores, they will change it a little bit. But that's basically the idea, right? This is what you can do. You can play with this payload as much as you want. You can make it invalid, right? Like this, or even like this. You can send it in the wrong format, right? Just like we've done with sign up, and see how this login behaves. You can modify the methods, right? And set it to the wrong methods. And also, this website should not be able to basically handle those, and so on, right? So all those test cases I outlined for you under our test cases here. You can basically look through them. They are pretty much very similar to the test cases that we've done during user creation, but feel free to use this and feel free to play with this API yourself, execute those test cases so you are a little bit more familiar with API testing. This is pretty much it. This is how you test an API call for post. And keep in mind that the major difference, right, between testing the GET response and the post response is basically the fact that the post response has the body in most of the cases, and this body can be modified. So we have to test different values. We have to test invalid data types. We have to test blank parameters being sent, and we have to make sure that our backend can handle all of this, and it will not break, right? Inserting large JSON is also a good test case just to make sure that that doesn't break our server and server can still work. let me show you one more thing with our user. I think this is the right credentials. When I log in or when I sign up using to4, if everything is correct, okay, I think I provided the wrong password. Okay, if everything is correct, it returns me certain information in the response payload. Now, when you are testing an API, you should be provided with documentation that includes everything that is being sent back to you. So if there is some information that is supposed to send back, you always need to verify that all of it is being received and all of it comes back in the right way. So if under your documentation you see that upon login you should get back ID, name, email, token, groups, is HIPAA compliant, was created language, email confirmation, and has opted in limited data user, that's exactly what we should get back, right? If in your documentation you see, for example, that upon login API you are expected to get back name, and then under your payload you don't see this parameter, this is a bug. And this can be a pretty bad one, because for example, if your front-end developers use this name parameter in order to show it somewhere on user page, and this name doesn't come back from the API, the worst thing that may happen is users may see the whole blank page. And I've seen those cases before. Sometimes user will see something like hello somebody, or like hello the question mark, right? Just because the name was not returned and front-end is expecting something. So always make sure that all the parameters are returned, and all of them basically you can see under your response. Now, when we work with login API, the most common thing that login API returns you will be the token. So when we log users in, we do it for one particular reason. We do it to verify that this user is correct and it has permissions to get to certain information. So in order to basically get access to our in-app experience, we have to confirm that we are who we are, right? If I want to go to the list of my favorite videos, for example, at first I have to log in as myself, so then I can open my own list, I can edit this list, and I can do whatever I want. Nobody else should be able to do that, right? We basically have our own account, and nobody else should be able to modify my own information. Now, from API standpoint, how do we actually prove it? How do we actually deal with the cases when we need to provide in-app experience only for the certain user? In order to do this, we will be using tokens. So you can see that every time I log in, this API returns me this token. Right, so I just logged in. This is the token CDS something. If I log in again, you can see that it keeps on returning me this token, right? So this is the secure token that will be basically used for my user only. Now, if I want to go to to4 website and modify something in my profile, so for example, let's go back here. If I go to this website and go to language setting, and we'll try to set the language preference. Let's just get rid of everything here. Let's say I pick French and click save. Over here, under Chrome Developer Network Tools, you will be able to find an API call that is updating this language. Again, it's usually a little bit hard to find right away. I just look for it. Active / language, this looks about right. And over here, if we look at this payload, you will be able to see that it's basically just setting the language to French, right? So if I just copy this whole URL, go back to my Postman, and here I will just import it, and send. You will notice that everything works, right? Status code 200, body, language, French, right? So that's what's happening. Now, if I go under headers, over here, you will be able to find the unique token for this user only. This is this one, X session token. So this is the token that belongs to this particular user. When we log in as this user upon post, this is the token that's being returned. And when we modify information, this is the token that basically confirms that I am who I am, right? So that's why when I want to change my language, I don't have to log in again. I can just provide the security token that was given to me upon login, and I can update my language preference. Now, if I turn this off, that's it. At this point, I no longer provide the identity of my user. I no longer basically tell who I am. So if I make this API call, you will usually see some error basically saying that this was not successful. Now, in this case, I don't see it, but if you just keep on looking through this payload, you will be able to find some additional tokens like X device ID, for example. And if you just keep on turning them off, eventually you find the combination that basically is assigned to this user only. So if I turn off the device ID, you will see that I start getting errors, and you see that this API call is no longer working. So tokens are used to basically clarify who user really is. They are usually given to us upon login. So if we go back to this login, you see that this is it. And also sometimes tokens are also passed in the headers. So if I go to my login API again, and over here in the body I see just token, and look in the headers that I receive from the backend, you will be able to find all kinds of information that also was sent to us. So in here, we can find some information like cookies and so on. And sometimes you also see additional tokens here that may basically clarify who exactly this user is. Just keep this in mind. This is important because every time we are testing something, in order to basically test the login experience, we will be using these tokens. So if you try to, for example, test the functionality when you can update user password, the first thing for you to do will be to log in, grab token value that you receive, and then when you make the second call to update the user, you will have to pass this token. Otherwise, without the token, you shouldn't be able to update this particular user information, and you will be getting errors. So keep this in mind. Tokens is something that we will be using, and every time you need to test some API information that is secured, usually there is a certain token that protects it. We've even seen tokens yesterday. So yesterday, the last time when we were testing our weather website, we actually had a token, which was app ID token, and it had the same functionality, right? Without providing app ID, we weren't able to see the weather. So those are the tokens, and that's basically how we use them. Keep in mind that tokens expire, and it's really up to the website or up to the company how long they want to keep their tokens active. For example, for weather data API, their tokens just stay forever and they never expire. But for all kinds of websites that do banking services or healthcare services, their tokens will expire usually within 5, maybe 10 minutes, and then they will ask users to re-log in to confirm their identity, right? So if you have a banking app, you probably are familiar with this functionality. When you are inactive for a few minutes, it logs you out, and then you are forced to log in again so you can keep on working with this app. This is done for security reasons. So in case somebody basically is inactive, we force this user to re-log in and confirm their identity before they can proceed into more actions. So that's basically it. Obviously, one thing that we just noticed with this website, we finally caught a 500 internal server error when we are not providing device ID and tokens. This would be a bug, and the bug report for this would be very simple. Just make it to this endpoint and not provide session token and device token, and observe. Expected result here would be to see 401 or 403, because we are not providing the right identity. 401 means user is unauthorized. 403 code means that the user doesn't have permissions for something. So one of the two would be okay. 400 probably would also be an okay status code in this case. But actual result is 500. Servers should never return for 500. It means they cannot process something. So if server is actually returning 500, that's a bug. And the priority for this kind of ticket, I would probably set to either low or medium. Users obviously not going to do something like this. We're not allowing users to update anything. So we do show some sort of error message, but server should be able to handle this. So ideally, this should be fixed. That's it. That's basically how we test a post API. All the test cases over here on your website, and that's basically it. So during our next lesson, we will continue API testing, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye, everyone.